do have a newer book. It's China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, the second edition. China keeps changing fast enough that I get updated already just after 3 years about what's changed and what hasn't. Thanks for that very fulsome introduction. It's great to be back in Boulder. I used to live in Indiana. I taught at Indiana University for 15 years. And my joke then was wherever I went to give a talk anywhere, the weather was better. And then I moved to Irvine in Southern California, and my joke is wherever I go, the weather's worse. But this was the rare time when I got off the plane and the weather was better here than when I left. Though I know you've been experiencing incredible weather that gave a strange sense to be preparing for a talk partly about, in a series on natural disasters and catastrophes, at the time that you were going through something very difficult here with the rains. And weirdly, what I'm going to talk about is catastrophe that's the exact opposite, which is drought, that led in part to the Boxer Uprising, which I'll give you. If you don't know anything about the Boxers, that's fine. Have you heard of the Boxer Rebellion? Had you heard of the Boxer Rebellion even before you started taking a class on China?
Yes.
Hands up. Okay. Had you heard of the Taiping Uprising before you started taking a class on China? Many fewer hands. The Boxer Rebellion, which wasn't really a rebellion, and they didn't really box, is one of the only events, really, from more than 100 years ago in China that, other than, say, names like Genghis Khan or Marco Polo, or the first emperor that would come to mind when people, or Confucius, when people think about China. It's one of the few historic events from the last couple of hundred years that has any kind of name recognition in the West. So I'm going to try to live up to both sides of Tim's introduction of me and both sides of what he said the Center for Asian Studies talks are. So I'm going to try to say some things that will be interesting to academic specialists and some things that will be interesting to people who have no academic background at all relating to China. And one of the ways to do this, there'll be a lot of kind of cheap references to pop culture. So comic books will come in and films and things like that, appropriately, I hope. First, I want to talk about the Boxer Uprising took place. The most important events in it were in the year 1900. And what they involved were an uprising of discontented rural Chinese, mostly young men, who rose up and started attacking foreigners and, even more so, Chinese Christians. They blamed this horrific drought that had struck North China on the fact that local gods were angry at the arrival of this unsettling foreign religion. Religion was spreading, and it seemed to be that the missionaries who had come along with them were getting more power, and this had thrown the world out of whack. And the Boxers believed that if they could get rid of the foreign religion, which meant getting rid of the foreigners and also the Chinese Christians, that then the gods would be reconciled and there would be rain again and good harvest. And also things would be better. There have been arguments about what other kinds of factors went into triggering the uprising, but that's in a thumbnail sketch what was going on. The most dramatic events in the uprising were when the Boxers laid siege to the foreign legation district in Beijing, which was the capital then, and there were representatives of different foreign countries there. They held the people, the foreigners, captive there for 55 days, and it captured the world's attention. It was one of the first events on the opposite side of the world that people in America followed in something that felt like real time, waking up each morning to read the newspaper to see what had happened with the fate of the foreigners in Beijing. And it took on sort of a height of hysteria when rumors circulated that all of the foreigners had been massacred by the Boxers. It turned out they hadn't, but it took a couple of days before word came that that had just been a rumor. Then foreign armies marching under 8 different countries' flags, European countries plus Japan plus the United States, marched into Beijing, freed the foreigners, held them hostage, and then went on. This was the other catastrophe, besides the natural catastrophe of the drought and the uprising Uprising, catastrophe of the Boxers attacking Christians. The third catastrophe was the foreign troops not only freed the hostages, but then carried out campaigns of revenge that ended up in massive numbers of deaths of Chinese, including many who had not been Boxers or supporters of it, in campaigns of retaliation. All right, it was a dramatic series of events. It captured world attention. It got written about intensively, and I'm going to be writing a book about it now, even though a while ago somebody wrote as follows about the Boxers, quote, "Of the Boxer movement in general, little remains to be said after the exhaustive work on the subject has been done." That was written in 1903. Since then, people have kept on exhausting themselves over this. Just recently, these are two of the most recent books about the Boxer Uprising. This one came out just a couple of years ago, and it focuses largely on the foreign armies that came in to suppress the rebellion. Yeah, people. Paul Cohen's History in Three Keys, which I'll draw on. It's an inspiration for my work. I bounce off of it, so I wanted to show his cover. It came out in 1997 and won a major book prize. A little while before that, about a decade, that was in the 90s. In the 80s, another book, The Origins of the Boxer Uprising by Joseph Escherich came out and won a major book prize as well. So there have been a lot of books about it written over the years, and they continue to come out. There have been books about it, books about the Boxers published in every decade since the event took place. Initially every year since it took place, slowed down maybe a little bit, but the commentary goes on. There's even one called the Boxer Catastrophe, in the theme of catastrophic events. And the other reason, so the reason why do you keep writing about something that people have already written about exhaustively? And I think this is a question worth asking about historical topics in general. And we have a few different ways, as historians, we tend to answer this. We say that sometimes there are new archives that become available or new kinds of materials that become available. And we can say the people who wrote out about it before didn't have access to the materials that now that they've come to light, we can now say different things about them. That happens when, say, new archives are discovered, or when, say, classified documents become declassified, or something like that with recent history. But there are other reasons why somebody might write about something that had been exhaustively written about before. It could be that new theoretical or methodological approaches have been pioneered that lead you to talk about the event in a different way. For me, a lot of the books that were about the Boxer Uprising, written by China specialists up until fairly recently, tended to focus primarily on the Boxer Uprising as an event in specifically Chinese history. There's been a turn toward increasing interest in world history, globalization, international history. So I think one of the things that we can do new is take seriously the international side of the movement, which is actually returning to a way it was written about early on. But the other reason why the Boxers, at least, continually can be, and I think are profitably revisited, is that what happened since they took place, has altered the meaning of how we think about what took place when they rose, and also has added to the story of the Boxers, if you believe, like me, that history isn't just what happened in the past, but it's what happened in the past and the stories that are told about what was happening in the past, or how the past is used to discuss specific things in the present. And to take something from the American case, after 9/11, Pearl Harbor had a different kind of meaning because a lot of the press described 9/11 as being like Pearl Harbor, challenging America in the same way, the first invasion of Americans since Pearl Harbor. That altered the way people talked and thought about Pearl Harbor. So an event that happens in the present can add a new layer to something that happens in the past, if what happens in the past, the history of it is partly its legacy. With the Boxers, there have been ways that the Boxers have meant different things at all kinds of moments since then, that it's been changed. It's an event that took place in 1900, or really through 1901, when finally a treaty was signed, the last catastrophe of the Boxer Uprising, where the Chinese had to pay an enormous indemnity to foreign countries for the deaths that the Boxers had caused, to the deaths of foreigners and destruction of foreign property. The Chinese government had to pay an indemnity for each thing that was done wrong, even though the foreign troops didn't have to pay any kind of indemnity for the Chinese who were killed and the property that was killed. After that point, in 1905, there was an anti-American boycott movement complaining about American rules that limited Chinese immigration to the United States. So there was a boycott of foreign goods. Immediately, because of memories of the Boxer Uprising that it involved violent anti-foreignism, some Americans who objected to the 1905 boycott said, this is just new Boxerism. It's like the Boxers all over again. And participants in that anti-American boycott quickly said, no, we aren't like the Boxers. We're not using violence, we're using a non-violent boycott. That kind of debate back and forth, is this new Boxerism or not, added another part to the Boxer story. And that happened again in 1919 and again in 1925. In 1966, the Red Guards, the Cultural Revolution broke out in China, and the Red Guards, who were fanatically loyal to Mao and objected to, among other things, they said there had been sort of the lingering influence of foreign ideology, of capitalism, and Western ideas from the past, so they went in part and destroyed things that were related to the foreign. And the Western press said, here they are, this is a picture of something from the Red Guards, they're like new Boxers. Mao, at that point, was saying, what was wrong with the Boxer Uprising? The Boxers were just trying to get China back under the control of the Chinese. We should be proud of the Boxers. The Boxers were patriots. So that was a different kind of clash. Rather than in 1905 saying, you're acting like Boxers, and the people being accused of it saying, no, we aren't. We're doing something different. This was one in which the Western press was saying, you're acting like Boxers again, and Mao said, well, that's a compliment. I'll take it that way. In 1979-81, when I first took Chinese history classes, or was just trying to pay attention to Chinese history, the Iran hostage crisis broke out, which has been made familiar, I think, again via Argo, the film last year. But Americans were held hostage in a distant capital. It was a crisis where we were watching it, following it day to day on television, wondering if they would get out. There were a lot of analogies brought up to the times in the past when Westerners, including Americans, had been held hostage by a hostile power. And so there were memories of the Boxers if the Boxers were invoked. In 1999, I happened to be in China. I'll show you a couple of photos of this, when there was an anti-NATO protest after American-led NATO forces in Yugoslavia had been attacking Serbia. You don't have to know the details of this. But the missiles hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese. And so Chinese, when I happened to be in China, started marching. And one place they marched was to the American embassy to complain about the behavior of the American-led forces. And they threw things at the American embassy. The American ambassador was pinned inside of the embassy for a certain amount of time. And USA Today came out with a headline saying it's like the Boxers all over again. Here, haven't they learned anything in 100 years? That you can't just, when you're angry, diplomats are supposed to be privileged. When you're in an embassy, it's supposed to be like a piece of your land. They're causing a threat to the American ambassador. This is like the Boxers. The Chinese response to that was, hasn't the West learned anything in the 100 years since the Boxer crisis? Here they are banding together to make trouble, invade another part of the world, former Yugoslavia, like they did 100 years ago. And once again, Chinese are dying unfairly because of this. So the Boxer tag that way was thrown back and forth as well. And I'll get to how, I think, for me at least, September 11th, even though it was a very different kind of event, made me think about the Boxers in a different way, and I'll get to that later. The Boxers have also stayed relevant if you think, again, that the interpretations of it or what's written about it. They've had a long power in influencing the world of literature. Not just one, but two early winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Pearl Buck and the Indian poet and philosopher Tagore, both were affected by the Boxer Uprising. Pearl Buck's father was threatened by Boxers during the uprising. Her family was over there as missionaries, so that comes into her life. Tagore was an Indian thinker who was concerned about the way the Western powers had taken over his country and felt a certain amount of fascination, like many people in colonized parts of the world, with the Boxer Rising, and wrote about it in his youth. It's been treated by famous novelists. An Chi Min is a famous now, originally Chinese author in the United States, wrote a novel about Pearl Buck, the novelist's life, and the Boxers figure in that in an episode. Sax Rohmer created the character Fu Manchu, that's had a long life as a kind of symbol of the first kind of the first really famous, infamous Chinese supervillain. And in some of the Fu Manchu stories, the Boxers come in as well. And now, most recently, the latest Nobel Prize winner, Mo Yan, who says he grew up hearing stories. He's from the part of China, North China, where the Boxer Uprising took place. He said he grew up hearing stories about them, and he's written a novel, Sandalwood Death, that's largely about that. About to come out and certain to be a bestseller in England and also, I think, the United States, The Empress Dowager Cixi by Rong Zhang, who wrote the book Wild Swans. It's the best-selling nonfiction English-language book on China of the 20th century. Sold 10 million copies. It will be, anything she writes will be widely read. She also wrote a biography of Mao, in which Mao could do no right. Now she's written a biography of the Empress Dowager Cixi, who, among other things, backed the Boxers for a critical moment in the middle of the siege of the foreign legations. The Qing dynasty decided, since they wanted to get their country back under control, they were having problems by foreign countries. They backed the Boxers. So in this book, Rong Zhang, the Empress Dowager can do very little wrong, but the Boxers are revisited, are seen, supporting the Boxers is seen as one of her rare missteps in this. Okay. My way of thinking about the Boxers, one of the things that I'm going to try to do in this book, telling the story that I think will be different and will partly build on what other people have been doing, is typically the Boxer Uprising at the time was understood as a story in which China and the rest of the world were on opposite tracks and doing opposite things. This was a cartoon comic of it put out by in a German magazine, and it shows the lone Chinese boxer and a group of foreign armies arrayed against him. If you look at this, the Boxer is seen as relying on the most primitive technologies. The Boxers imagined that through certain kinds of martial arts techniques, they could defeat a much better armed foreign power. This is an idea that shows up periodically in colonial or quasi-colonial settings. When you're overwhelmed by the technology of the other side, you come up with magical ideas that think you can sort of even the odds through some kind of spiritual techniques or special traditions. It happened in the version of it in the United States with the ghost dance after Native Americans had been defeated over and over again by guns. It's happened in Africa and other parts of the world as well. This plays into this idea. You have the boxer, the Chinese who are unarmed, and they never wore boxing gloves, by the way. It's just the term boxer was something the Western press came up with. They did use martial arts techniques, and their name was the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. So there was a basis for it, but this shows how it got sort of lampooned and a bit ludicrous. So you have this idea of lots of things about the two events that are the two sides that are very different. One is associated with modernity and technology. the other with kind of magical thinking and through force. There are very few photographs of the Boxers. This is one of the rare ones. And again, you get this idea. In this one, what they had going for was there were a lot of them, the mass of them, but they're seen as very kind of primitive, as standing up against a much more developed foreign powers. Then this is an image of the martyrs, the Chinese martyrs, Chinese and foreign, the Christian martyrs of the Boxer Uprising, where you see they're looking very orderly, something very different from the sign, the sort of simple crowd. And so you have this idea of this two kind of irreconcilable sides that had nothing much in common with each other. You also have it in images. This is all the different armies from the West that come in, and again you have this idea of organized armies versus a kind of primitive rabble. And clearly it's two sides against each other. Even here, when they get some weaponry shown in it, it's quite simple compared to the more advanced weaponry on the other side. So there are a variety of ways in which what I want to try to do is talk about how the story can be told, or we can look back at it and focus actually more on what the two sides had in common. Beginning with the fact that it was actually a war, rather than getting away from the idea of rebellion. Rebellion's wrong because they weren't trying to overthrow their own government. It was more of an uprising, but it was at one point more the Boxers became a kind of quasi-official militia when the Qing armies started backing them. So for part of the time, this was really the Boxer War, as one recent book put at it, where there were Chinese forces, which at a certain point had all kinds of weaponry, once the Qing backed them, against Western forces with maybe better armed and better disciplined, but not all that different in that way. But I want to get to some other ways in which the parallels, as opposed to the contrasts, can be largest. And let's begin with the drought. In some of the discussions of the drought by missionary press or Western press at this time, it was made to seem very exotic that the Boxers believed that the natural world was controlled by the spirit world, and that by getting rid of the foreigners, they could make it rain. This from certain kinds of is magical thinking. But when you actually look at what missionaries were writing at the time, they were actually saying very similar things, only saying that if they prayed hard enough to God, that then there would be, then the rain would fall. And they would say over and over again, in very much the same kind of equivalent to that sort of magical thinking, that they would hope that that things would change from that. And they actually also believed, another thing that was seen as particularly magical to Boxers, was their belief that they could make themselves invulnerable to bullets if they did the right incantations and things. So even if they were overwhelmed by a much stronger technology on the other side, the Boxers believed by doing certain incantations, bullets wouldn't kill them. The missionaries also said that even though when they were grossly outnumbered by Boxers and surrounded by them, they believed that divine providence would come in and save them if they prayed the right way as well. So you can see this is one of the themes that Paul Cohen looks at in History in Three Keys, the parallels between the two of them, that they actually both were saying when times are very difficult, divine intervention can level the playing field, can help you. When the natural world is out of whack, it has something to do with God's plan or the God's plans, and you can do things to get it back on track. Another thing was the Boxers felt that the combination of the drought and the coming of the foreigners meant they were living in a millenarian moment, a moment when it was a kind of all or nothing apocalyptic moment that either they would be saved or the world would be destroyed. Here's a sample of a diary from a missionary at the time. These are troublous times. Whether they are the troublous times the Bible refers to as coming in the last days or not, whether or not they are those last days. What with wars and rumors of war, pestilence and famine, false teachers, there are signs enough. We simply have to put our trust in Him, who is our leader and for whose sake we are here, and see if we will get through this. So while the Boxers were praying for divine intervention and trying to go through rituals and thinking that against all odds they would prevail against the better armed West, the missionaries were thinking in fairly similar terms. And this same missionary woman, in a later part of her diary, once the Boxers are threatening her, says, "Our friends at home will have suspense, but not such as ours when the heart refuses to act properly and knees and legs shake in spite of all efforts to be brave and quiet, trusting in God. We do trust in Him. This is our witness. No matter what comes, we are trusting in Him, believing firmly that all this tumult and alarm and real danger, rumors of war and terrible evil are only working out His infinite purpose for our good to come to China. Each day we live, we feel it a deeper truth that man proposes, God disposes. He has made the wrath of even these evil people around us to praise Him." So there was a similar kind of sense of a millenarian moment, an apocalyptic moment. The odds were stacked against them, but if things were done right to appeal to a kind of spiritual world, then even those who thought they would be vanquished would survive. And there was a plan. The most kind of magical thinking that's thought of with the Boxers was the idea that they believed that spirits would descend from the heavens and fight beside the spirits of their ancestors would descend from heaven and fight beside them, or they would become possessed by spirits, and that would help them become invulnerable as well. Henrietta Harrison has just done a book called The Missionary's Curse and Other Tales from a Chinese Catholic Village that looks at a Catholic village during this period, over a long stretch of time, but including in 1900. And she finds that in that village, when it was threatened by the Boxers, who believed in spirit soldiers coming down to fight beside the Boxers and even the odds, within that Catholic village there was a belief that was connected to European Catholicism, but had taken on a slight twist going on to China as well, that the souls in purgatory, who were in between heaven and hell, if you prayed to them sufficiently, they would come down and fight beside you on the fields. And the stories were told in this Catholic village that the reason why they had survived and they were not killed during the Boxer Uprising was because the souls from purgatory had come down and fought beside them. So these are very directly parallel tales. All right, one way in which the story of the Boxers, or what the Boxers were doing and what the foreigners were doing, was very different. And how, say, I've been talking about how the Westerners tell the story versus the Chinese tell the story. But let's think about how the Chinese tell the story that would seem to, a key part of the Chinese story has always been, let's not focus so much on the Boxers, let's focus on invasion. There was an invasion, a gradual invasion before the Boxers, that's why the Boxers rose up. The Westerners have been nibbling away at China, and Japan had started to join in as well, and Russia. And so the Boxers lashed out. And then there was a really fuller scale invasion by the foreign powers that came into our country and wreaked violence on our country. So in the Chinese story, what makes the Boxer crisis a very different story if you're in the West or in China, is because from a Chinese point of view, this was an invasion of our country. The Boxers never left their country. Okay, you can say that in the Western version of the story, embassies, consulates, that area in Beijing is supposed to be like your own country. But the Western imagining of the Boxers didn't even stop there. The Western imagining of the Boxers had it that the Boxers would, if left to their own devices, invade the rest of the world and take over the world. So part of this apocalyptic thinking of the Boxers was, if we don't do something now, our country will be lost completely. That even was paralleled by some of the foreign imaginings. Even though the Boxers were never thinking of leaving China, this kind of imagery in which the boxer was dehumanized into a kind of savage animal here, would eventually, if left undevices, go into the rest of the world. And here is something from an American magazine of the time. Said, "This is the gravest crisis that Christendom has faced since the Moorish invasion of Europe. Continued success of the Boxer Uprising might mean more than the mere closing of China against foreign nations. It might result in the overrunning of Asia and attempted intrusion even to Europe of Mongolian hordes striving to repeat the mighty crusades of Genghis Khan." So it's not that this was going to happen, but the imagining of it took on that kind of parallel as well. The biggest parallel between the boxers, the way to tell the story of the boxers in a parallel stressing between the Chinese and the foreign side is to focus on atrocities, though. There were atrocities committed by both sides. So even though the Western way of telling the story was there was the savage rising that attacked us, and then we restored order. The Chinese way of telling the story, at least at certain points, has been foreigners were invading, and then they invaded even more and brutalized us. In fact, there was a lot of brutality on both sides, and there was a kind of set of parallels between them, and some people at the time thought of it that way. This is a quote from the time. When things are remembered, this was after the foreign acts of revenge had gotten out of hand. It is difficult to believe that civilization is anything but a thin veneer of artificial polish over an unchanging substance of savagery. There were Western critics of the revenge campaigns that went on. Mark Twain was probably the most famous of them. He said, if I was a Chinese, I would be a boxer, because what were they trying to do? Just get control of their own country. And then he went on about how can we call them savages when once the foreign troops came in, they behaved savagely as well. There were cartoons like this, which mocked the idea of the West coming in as a kind of chivalrous force and then drenching China in blood. There was this as well with this idea of it began with barbarism attacking civilization, and then it ended with civilization attacking barbarism exactly the same way. And I won't belabor this, but my feeling of this, when I say that 9/11 put a new meaning on the Boxers to me, is initially with the horrors of the attack on the Twin Towers, what was seen was very much, and for understandable reasons, a savage act coming into kind of violating an American space. But by the time you got to Abu Ghraib and the kind of images of torture and things that were being done on the other side in the revenge campaigns, if you want to call them that, inspired by the attacks, at least some people were seeing parallels between this and saying that the divide, at least, between terrorism and counterterrorism was hard to draw. And that was a kind of moment that some of the world at least felt as you went from 1899, 1900 to 1901. And there are parallels there I'd be happy to talk about as well. I think that tension between sort of who is really civilized here, and if we think about it, I mean, a lot of things about that moment in history. In 1900, it was the start of a new century. It was right after the first rules of warfare had been introduced. Countries were supposed to fight in a civilized way, but in this war in China, they immediately violated most of the notions of civilized war. There was a lot of anxiety over this, and there needed to be an effort. In part, there were some Westerners who criticized the behavior. There were others, though, who defended it. The threat had been so horrible that any kind of countermeasures were justified, which again is something we've heard in our own day. But there was also a subtler form of kind of displacement, of trying to regain the upper hand and show that despite appearances, they really are the savages here. And this was in one, there was a lot of Western discussions of China at the time about public executions being a sign of great savagery. And so after the Boxers were suppressed, high officials who had supported the Boxers had to be executed to make up for their support. And so Westerners wanted this, in fact insisted that this be done, but had Chinese carry it out. So it was a kind of displacing the act of savagery back onto Chinese actors. And the most famous example of this, getting to Fu Manchu and my first cheap nod to popular culture, was in one of the stories of Fu Manchu, who's seen as driven by a lifelong hatred of the West, which is out of all proportion with anything. He wants to destroy every living Westerner. When he's given any motivation for this, it's that he's seen, described in one of the films, as having been quite pro-Western. And then after the Boxer Uprising, when the foreign troops came in to settle scores, even though he had nothing to do with the Boxer Uprising, foreign troops had killed his wife and child. And that launched him on a lifelong vendetta against the West. And he became the symbol of savagery again and violence out of control, even if, at a certain point, the Boxers were thrown in, the revenge against the Boxers was thrown in as partly a motivation. Another parallel between the two things, the Boxers and the West, the studies of the Boxer Uprising, one of the things that has come out of it is that the Boxers generated support for their movement and were kind of framed it in terms of popular performances of opera. The gods that were supposed to descend to help them fight were from operatic performance, were made well known through operatic performances. There was, according to some analysts in Chinese, the line between religion and theater and between theater and war was blurrier. And that you actually had people kind of preparing for warfare through these operatic performances and taking characters from the opera onto their persona as a fighting force. So there's an intertwinement of the kind of theatrical and the lived experience in the Boxer Rising. There was something similar in the other side as well. During the siege of the legations, when the foreigners were held captive, in order to try to get themselves brave and to pass the time, the foreigners read out and sometimes acted out scenes from a time in the past when foreigners in India, during the mutiny of 1857, had been held captive and feared for their lives. And the Westerners held captive in Beijing acted out that drama from an earlier period and took heart from the fact that it had ended happily. And they would say which person in their group was most like which character in the events of 1857 in India. So there was a kind of blurring of the lines between theatricality and the war. After the event, already in 1901, there were reenactments in Earl's Court in London of the events of the saving of the Boxer, the saving of the foreign legations. And I'll just mention one last parallel to the 9/11 moment, which was so intensely, everybody was focused on that so much in the West when it happened and right afterward, that there were people who said that you shouldn't make fictional films about it immediately because nerves were too raw from the terror that people had seen of what had actually happened. When this was performed at Earl's Court in 1901, the same critique was made. We shouldn't be reenacting this. The wounds are still too raw. It will take time before we can treat this in a kind of fictional way. So that was when something so intensely a media event and whatever thing, that it can seem almost a taboo to just play with it. But it didn't stop people from playing with it and reenacting it. The Buffalo Bill Wild West show, which had made its name playing out Cowboys versus Indians performances, Forces, in 1901 was doing the lifting of the siege of the Beijing legations. And blurring the line between the real and the false, they got some veterans from the foreign campaigns to lift the siege, to act in this with weapons that had come from that place. So if you think the kind of blurring of media events and the quick flow of news into popular culture is new, it goes back a long way. There were Boxer wind-up toys made, times sold. There are still Boxer toys made. You could reenact things. I didn't mention the Boxers sometimes says East versus West, but there were Indian soldiers in the British forces that attacked, and there were Japanese soldiers on the other side. There's been a long history of political cartoons in which the Boxers are brought into the picture one way or another. This from the Cultural Revolution. As I mentioned, I just thought I would show you this is the legitimating move that China specialists make to show that they've been to China. This was during the anti-American protests and anti-NATO protests of 1999 that was referred to as New Boxerism by some of the Western press, but it was complaining about a group foreign invasion of another country, so the Chinese press was saying, haven't you all learned anything since that? The invasion of 1900. There were films made of the Boxers through time, how it's been kept alive, and this would be the other parallel, I think, between the Boxer story in the West and the Boxer story in China, is just that it stayed alive through many media, through long periods of time in a way few events have. This wasn't a French movie. I just found the best poster I could find on the web was of in French. It was called 55 Days in Peking. It was made in the early 1960s in the height of the Cold War. It's a bad movie, but fascinating. And there were also movies made, Chinese movies, a whole series of them. This one is very interesting to me because it shows, and I talked about earlier, that there are sort of, when you stress the different ways the stories are told, in the West it's all about the insurrection and the threat to the Westerners. And then in 55 Days in Peking, once the foreign legations are saved, the credits roll. And you don't hear about the atrocities committed by the Western troops and Japanese troops. In the Chinese version of it, though, it's often also about the invasion. So this was a film that English language title is The Boxer Rebellion. Chinese title is The 8 Foreign Armies, Allied Armies. So it was sold in different ways, presented in different, it's a kung fu movie and it has all that. But it's marketed in one case with a lot of attention to the invasion, in the other to the most focus be on the rousing. This I just found out about, and it's a B movie made in Thailand about the Boxer Uprising. So it isn't just Hollywood and Hong Kong. And in terms of the staying power in popular culture, the Boxers didn't just serve as the basis for a B Hollywood movie in the 1960s, but for an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when it was a cult television show, in which one of the vampires in the story is kind of flashed back to an earlier stage in his life, facing an earlier vampire slayer, who in that case was a young Chinese woman who he killed. And so it takes this, it's hard to show the television show, but there is a comic strip made based on it, so I could find that. And it actually has a pretty good description of it, and it shows the upheaval then, and it has a young Chinese woman being killed by the vampire who's gone back to kill the young Chinese woman who's the vampire slayer. And my favorite line from it is a term often used for foreigners at this time, both by the Boxers and by others, was to speak of Westerners as foreign demons, foreign devils. And so this is an actual foreign devil, a vampire, a British vampire, who's back there killing him. And he says, and the Chinese man says, "You killed my grandmother." He says, "Bugger off, old man, and keep it down, right? We're British, and we're vampires. That's 2 strikes against us if we're discovered." I had thought that was the first comic book about the Boxers, but it wasn't at all. 55 Days in Peking was not just a movie I discovered today, actually on the shuttle on my smartphone on my way over here, but there was a comic strip made of it that has the, that I have to find on eBay and pay way too much money for and read. But for now, I can just show, there are a couple of things from it where they show, they focus, the Westerners only come into this as a civilizing presence. As I say, things end as soon as the legations are saved. And there was also something in the Commando comic book series, this was in 2010, about the Boxers. But the most interesting comic book, and so I'm going to end with, is a graphic novel, the most recent publication explicitly about the Boxers to come out, has just come out. It was just longlisted for a National Book Award, young adult work. And it is actually the thing, people, when you're writing a book about a subject that's been much covered, people say, hasn't it been done too much, is one thing. And aren't you worried that somebody else might be working on a book that's taking the same line as yours? Especially with mine. I've been saying I've been working on this book for about 6-7 years now. And then there's a book will come out on the box and I'll think, oh, thank goodness, it doesn't actually do the kinds of things that I'm thinking of doing. But this graphic novel is actually the closest thing to a version of the Boxer Uprising, like the one you've just heard, that has come out so far. Because it's not one book, but two that are paired. It's called Boxers and Saints. And the graphic novelist says he didn't know a lot about Chinese history before he started researching this. But he actually has a bibliography that shows he's read some of the books I've cited, including some of the best ones, including History in Three Keys. And he says that one of the things about this movement that he found fascinating was it conflicted him, because he's a Chinese-American Christian. And so he always felt that learning about the event, he could see the point of Chinese who didn't want their country to be taken away from them by the foreign invaders. And yet he could identify also with the Chinese Christians who were being persecuted because of their faith. And so he told it as a pair of different stories. And here I'll just show you two images from it that illustrate, better than I could ever hope to illustrate, elements I've described. This is showing the Boxers calling down the spirits to help fight them. And these are spirits from wearing the masks of Peking opera, or of folk opera, rather, who are coming down to descend from the heavens to give them special force. That's from Boxers. It tells the story from the perspective of a young Chinese man being swept up in the movement, the youth. But then there's Saints, which show the story from the side of a young Chinese girl and then young woman who converts to Christianity. And one of the things that gives her strength to continue is her imagining that she sees apparitions from the stories that she's been hearing, that Joan of Arc comes down and gives her faith, and that at a time when you're up against great odds, you can be strong. And rather than coming down with the spirit gods to fight beside, there are visions of angels. Thanks for your attention.